They'll be introduced in a minute, but I just want to thank everybody. This is an incredibly important topic, and the Chamber of Commerce has been partnering really well with the city to put this together, because I think one of the biggest things we hear is that there's no workforce housing, and not just affordable, but places for our employees to live and be, and we want to continue to have the city economically thrive. So we're going to give you some information today. There's a lot of chance to ask questions, and then Stephen, who's been working really hard on this, is going to tell you about some of the projects already in place, and maybe we can bounce back some ideas here and there on what we can do moving forward. But as you know, we're the second most expensive place to live in the U.S. Average price is about $740,000. I think only in 23, about 20% of people could actually afford to get into a new home. Interestingly enough, one of the cheapest places, I would say inexpensive, to live was in Eureka. So hopefully it's a little far from you, but so anyway, I am Talia Hart from the Chamber. Again, thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Jessica from my team, Stephen and Griselda, who put a lot of work into this, and then we have some council members here. I'm going to introduce you to Mayor Ariel Kelly now, so come on up. And then we have David Higley here, we have Ron Edwards. Did I forget any council members that I saw come in? No. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Talia, and so much gratitude to the Chamber for bringing us together today. This is such an important topic and near and dear to my heart. Vice Mayor David Higley, Councilmember Ron Edwards, who are here with us today. Our City Council really stands shoulder to shoulder about housing being one of the most pressing issues that we need to tackle in our community, but we also know that we can't do it alone. So we are grateful that you're here today, bright and early in the morning, thank you. Or for those of you who are just coming off your harvest shift, thank you for sticking with us before you go to bed. And thank you to our panelists for being here, sharing your words of wisdom with us. We really appreciate the expertise that's in this room, and the subject matter experts, which are those who are employers in our community, who really understand the challenges of retaining a vibrant workforce and housing being an integral piece of that. Gratitude to our city staff who are working today, Stephen Sotomayor, our housing director, and Griselda, who's in the back, working every day to increase housing solutions for this community. We know housing is a huge challenge, but now we have the data to back it up. Thank you for those who've already participated in our workforce housing survey. That survey really underscores not just that housing is important, but that it's an integral part of the success of local business. We need to be able to have housing solutions that meet the needs of both our employers as well as the workforce who is already working in Healdsburg or who aspire to work in Healdsburg. It's not just an economic issue, it's an environmental issue. We know we have employees in this community who are driving thousands of miles each month to commute back and forth to Healdsburg. Over 5,000 people commute into Healdsburg every single day. Some of those who are spending hours upon hours on the road, decreasing their quality of life because they can't be there for PTA meetings or go to the after-school soccer practice in the communities that they're living in. And they love Healdsburg and they want to live here too because they're already invested in this community. So today we're gonna move beyond identifying what are those challenges that we all, I think, are aligned on, and start working towards what are some of those solutions. This has become such an important issue for our council. We are taking on the next phase of our housing action, and over the course of the next year, we're really going to be rolling up our sleeves and implementing policy solutions that includes potentially going to the ballot next November to work on our growth management ordinance. And so we can't do this without you all. It can't be done in a vacuum. But employers in this community have a really strong voice. Our chamber in this community has a really strong voice. So we want to partner with you on identifying what are the solutions that we can agree upon and start to move forward swiftly to right the ship in terms of the lack of housing that is so desperately needed in our community, specifically for our workforce. So thank you for being here today. It's a big, big step. And if you haven't participated in that workforce housing survey, I believe that opportunity is still there. But we're really trying to gather the data so we can better identify those solutions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Director Sotomayor. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Sonoma, the Housing Director for the City of Healdsburg, and I just want to welcome everybody here today. I appreciate your attendance. This gathering couldn't be more timely or vital. As you know, workforce housing is not just an issue, it's a backbone of our community. Businesses thrive when employees have stable, affordable place to live. Conversely, when housing becomes a hurdle, our local economy and community well-being are put at risk. Today we have an exceptional panel of experts who will share not only their comprehensive knowledge, but also actionable insights that can guide us in addressing the housing challenges we face. Each has an impressive portfolio of accomplishments that makes them uniquely qualified to inform our discussions on affordable housing strategies. As we engage in this dialogue, remember that the keys to solving our community's housing crisis are held by each one of us. So let's delve into this critical issue with the earnestness it demands. The housing landscape won't change itself, so let's get to work, or should I say let's get to workforce housing. That fell flat. It's too early. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. We have what I would call a dream team here to talk about workforce housing. Our first panelist, starting over on our right-hand side, is Larry Florin, the CEO of Burbank Housing. He carries with him more than 30 years of public and private sector experience in real estate, community, and economic development. And he's not just a thought leader, he's a change maker actively involved in housing projects right here in Healdsburg. His insight will provide us with real-world solutions to the affordable housing crisis. Up next, we have Will Seppi, the president and CEO of Costeaux at French Bakery and the chair of the Healdsburg Chamber of Commerce. With his business acumen and his in-depth understanding of community dynamics, Will contributes a neat perspective on how local businesses can play a pivotal role in addressing housing challenges. Next, we have Michael Pyatok, is an architect with over 5 decades of experience in more than 40,000 units of housing to his credit. Recognized as one of the 50 most influential people in the U.S. in the housing industry, Michael brings a wealth of expertise in designing affordable and equitable housing solutions. His award-winning designs are a testament to his commitment to housing justice. Whitman is our newly appointed Executive Director of the Community Development Commission and brings to the table a focus on equity-centered housing production. With her visionary solutions, such as a groundbreaking nonprofit loan fund and a housing-focused joint powers authority, she has already brought in over $102 million in new financial resources for Sonoma County. Michelle's innovation-first approach makes her a cornerstone in creating sustainable and affordable housing. Last but definitely not least is Jim Heid, who's the founder of Urban Green and is a member of the Housing Element Work Group that just recently completed our housing element that shapes Healdsburg's future housing landscape. His book, Building Small, has received national acclaim and serves as a foundational guide for communities looking at alternate housing options. As we delve into today's topics, let's remember that transforming the landscape of affordable housing starts with this conversation. And so if we could join us in welcoming our panel today. Thank you very much for joining us. So I'd like to take a quick moment, if we can jump to the next slide. And I hit it again, please. We recently held a workforce housing survey, which many of you have taken. We had quite a few respondents and we got quite a bit of data back. And let me just tell you, it's not surprising what we found from the business community. I think the number one thing is that nearly 70% of respondents rated that affordable housing is moderately to critically important to their business. Consistently in city surveys, we see that affordable housing is one of the top 2 priorities or top 3 priorities within the city. But within the business community, that stands true as well, which is demonstrated through the survey. Cost and availability are the most significant barriers, which should come as no surprise to most of us. But that's definitely something that is on our panel for discussion. As far as operational limits, a quarter of businesses surveyed had to limit monthly operations due to the lack of year-round employees. 42 respondents actively assist their employees in finding housing, subsidized housing, or have housing, which is very commendable across the board and something to take a look at. And then finally, 70% of businesses view that having employees reside within the city of Healdsburg is beneficial. And the variety of reasons that came in is anything from having somebody close by to open up a store, or having an employee local so that they don't have an increased commute. We heard environmental concerns. So there's quite a different variety of reasons and why people enjoy having their employees here. And finally, the housing needs that most of the employers said is that 75% of the housing needs are for individuals, followed by families with young children and couples. That's an interesting point to hear from the business community, and also helps to decide how we'll drive design. And finally, what we learned from remote work is that about 50% split. 50% of employers offer remote work, 50% don't. But what we also found is that less than 25% have 50% of their workforce working remotely, which makes sense based upon the economies and the types of businesses that we have that you would need on-site personnel. Next slide. Next, I'll talk a little bit about demographics and data, and I'm going to move through these because I think we want to get to our panelists here. But just some quick data points that we have. Since 2020, the city's population has decreased, as many of us know from the latest census, and our housing units have increased. As you can see in 2023, our population decreased slightly from 2030. Some of the nuances relevant to the workforce and the workforce housing is that we, through this data collection process, we're in the process of doing a housing needs assessment. And as a part of this, we had Economic and Planning Systems pull some initial data for this presentation. We're gonna have more of this that will come to the City Council at a later date. But what we found is that the numbers of earners per household with earnings is about 1.6, and the number of people in a household with earnings is about 3.3. So we're seeing that families and family type housing, that gives us an indication that if we go with the HUD formula, that 4-bedroom housing might be something that we need to look at, or larger units. Next slide. One thing that we noticed is, and this should come as no surprise, is that we're seeing a decline in the younger population. We're seeing that our typical working age force is actually remaining relatively steady, which means that they either own or rent or they have stabilized within our community. But we also see that our senior population is rising as it goes, which also can lend to some talking points around what is going to happen with our housing stock over time. How can we look at options for seniors as they choose to downsize, and how does that free up our housing stock? All great questions to ask. Next slide. So when we look at population and job trends from 2010 to 2023, we can see that what we see is that during that period, what we noticed is that jobs are going down, jobs have recovered. And you'll notice that what we can see right here is that in 2020, we can see that the pandemic definitely had an effect. But what we can also see is that Healdsburg recovers well. And so we can see that the decline in population compared to the increase in jobs is an interesting data point that we can look at. And as we continue to refine these demographics and trends, these will be brought forward. So next slide, please. And then finally, this is a measure that we used. Back in 2017, 2018, there was a housing action plan. And part of those goals was to get 30% of those that live in Healdsburg to be able to those that work in Healdsburg to be able to live here. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing is that there's been a steady decline since about 2017 or 2016 on what that percentage is, with the most recent around 15% with our last data collection. Next slide, please. And so, what are the occupations that we have? So, the one thing to note out, and if you can't read this, I'll go ahead and do it, is highlighted in green that the highest number of employees we have is food preparation and service-related occupations. That should come as no surprise. Followed by sales and related occupations and office and administrative support operations. What you can notice is that the 3 occupations with the highest number of jobs also pay the lowest wages. And so that speaks a little bit to the challenge of what types of incomes we have to build for if we want to support our workforce. If you notice and you probably can't read it, there's an indicator on the left with a series of numbers that are ranging from less than 1 or not, but that is in relation to the rest of the nation on average, how Healdsburg stands. So at 1, that means we're on par with the average of the nation and the total amount of jobs within that industry. Anything above that becomes that we are more. And so you can see in food preparation, we're nearly double the amount of workers that generally average city would have in the United States. But you can also take a look in the different areas of these sectors that you can see there's opportunities here in lower areas to attract different talent to the city. But one thing that is important to this conversation is noting that most of our workers fall within the lower incomes. Next slide. And finally, where are workers coming from? And you know, we will post this up on the city's website. It's a little bit hard to read right now, so what I'll do is walk you through it. What we can see here is that largely that our workers are coming from Santa Rosa. You can see that the next one is Healdsburg, and then followed by Windsor. And other would be any other city not listed here or the unincorporated county. But what we're seeing is that we do have a large commute coming into the city, which has different impacts on the quality of life of employees, the environment, as well as the ability for businesses to attract and retain employees. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I'd like to hand it over to our panel. And what we'd like to do today is I'd like to open it up by asking a question to Michael about his experience and having him go through it, and then we will continue. If the audience has questions, we'll moderate it for the panel, and I also have some additional questions. But if we could start it out, we'll switch presentations here. And so my question for Michael is to go with over, you'll forgive me. That is quite the jumble. You know, with over a half a century in experience in designing affordable housing and housing units, you've seen many cycles and changes throughout your career in this industry. What has been some of the persistent challenges in affordable housing and housing design and the type of building techniques that are used? And if you could share with us a little bit, that'd be great. Thank you.
I feel a little uncomfortable going first because usually the architect I see as the caboose on the train of development. You know, developers are the engine and all the financiers are the juice that keeps it going. And we're at the back end, kind of giving advice to the people at the front end, but I feel a little uncomfortable upstaging all of these powerhouses. But thank you for the opportunity. I picked through projects from the past, but maybe just the last 12 or 15 years, just to highlight how things have changed, how much they've changed in these last 15 years in the cost of development, what we used to be able to do, what is very difficult to do now. I mean, what we were able to do at the Randall, we often cannot do with our other affordable housing. We were fortunate to be tagging along with a private developer who was very supportive of really making sure we could do what we felt would make for a good, handsome building. But that doesn't always happen. We used to be able to do it. This is something from about 15 years ago in Palo Alto, which you know is an expensive community. This was in a neighborhood called Professorville. Lots of beautiful old craftsmen and Victorian houses, and we inserted very low-income family housing into that neighborhood. We were able to pay for a garage that's half in the ground, and there are townhomes over flats to make the 3-story building. If we could go on to the next one. And that was about $250,000 a unit 15 years ago. To do that today would be $700,000 to build at least, and then another $3 million in soft costs. It would be $1 million a unit. Go ahead to the next one. And it's the same for, that's more of that particular development or what it feels like today. Go ahead. Go ahead. In other neighborhoods, these are all, I started out with these 3-story, sort of neo-traditional, trying to fit into the neighborhoods of single-family homes and getting densities of maybe 30 to the acre, which is what these are. They're townhomes over flats with tuck under parking in the back. Even the tuck under parking now is open air, but it's gotten very expensive to do. As you saw at the Randall, we had to have a whole steel structure there to support it for seismic reasons, with the wood sitting on top. So the more you can just have open air parking without having to build on top of it, you're going to save a bunch of money. Instead of spending $60,000 a car to house the car, maybe you spend $10-15 for the pavement, the lighting, and the landscape. Now, that means you have to have more land in order to park all of them outdoors, but think about it. Parking them under the building is a land cost. 5 times more than just leaving them out in the open air. So sometimes it maybe pays to get a little more land to park them outside than to build underneath. This was similar to the Randall in that, no, it's not similar to the Randall. This is not family housing. These are all studio units for workforce housing, again in Palo Alto. And the building is really a simple box, and the front gets some pizzazz because it has to face a fairly major street, but it's really all small studios. And that was completed probably about 10 years ago, and maybe it was in the high 200, maybe 300,000 max. Okay. This is downtown Oakland, and this was finished in '09, so that's 14 years ago, with a podium garage that's half submerged in the ground, so it creates all these outdoor stoops. And they're stacked townhomes, 2-story units above 2-story units. That reduces the number of corridors that have to be, and they're outdoors, so they don't have to be ventilated, and they don't have to be lit except at night. So it was a way of actually savings by you spending more on stairs, but you're still saving a lot in operational costs by not having to operate these indoor double-loaded corridor buildings. You know, some mechanical engineers have shown that the double-loaded corridors, the corridors alone, consume more energy than all the units combined. And think about that. With all the stuff that we have in an apartment, all that electricity that's being consumed is less than what it takes to ventilate and light corridors. So try to avoid those corridors. This was using now modular construction. These were only finished about 3 or 4 years ago. And we did save about 4 or 5 months in the construction period. Yes, so there is some savings. But there are other costs that still are incurred. There's a lot of on-site labor, and those on-site labor costs have gone up. So 3 years ago, while we used this kind of construction, I think it was pretty much a wash compared to conventional. And I think part of that, again, was this subterranean garage underneath the entire development. These were 5-story building and then a bunch of townhomes in the back that you can see there. So there are there's potential in the modular if you can avoid, again, having to spend so much money on cars. Go ahead. Again, the same thing. This is a Native American project in Phoenix. There were flats and townhouses combined, again, to cut down on the amount of corridor, and all the corridors were open air. The parking was partially underground, but we had, not on grade, but under a podium. But we had some savings in that we didn't need as many cars because we were a half a block from a light rail station. And we had some vacant land next door that they could park some additional cars on. So we didn't have to spend so much money on the parking. And finally, I think there might be one more in there. This is next to a BART station. So the parking was only 0.5. It's still a podium, but again, it's only 0.5. So that was a savings there. And the courtyard then in the center is actually on the ground. So you get real trees and real planting. And it gets more lush over the time. So we move on from there. So in this last line of thinking I've been doing now since I've so-called retired, I've been working with the city of Oakland, preparing these quote-unquote cabin villages for the homeless, where they get a little 8x10 cabin that's heated, has electricity, it has a little refrigerator, a bed, a fan. You basically got that problem solved. You're out of the weather, you're secured, a host of other problems that persist that I won't get into here. But in thinking about it, what I realize is there's no program once they're in the cabins, and they're going out of their minds, waiting for the day when there might be an affordable housing unit that they can qualify for. So they're going to be in those cabins for a long time. So they need a program. So this idea was to create a boarding school in a sense. You get to live there, but there are classroom modules. There are things to do, there are things to learn. And a lot of those folks do want to be brought up to speed in the computer world, the basic program that will help get them a job. But in thinking about it, there were 2 types of units that became obvious, and then I began to think, well, this could easily be workforce housing for singles and couples, again, not for families. But on the right-hand side, in the middle actually, is a 10x10 room. And it's just like the dorm. We've done student housing. These are like dorm rooms for freshmen, where you get a bed, you get an armoire, a couple of armoires for your clothes and things, drawers under the bed, a desk, a half-size refrigerator, and a microwave. Now downstairs, there's a meals program, and there's some lounges for recreational activities, but that's a 10x10 for singles. A dormitory style housing might be a possibility. And in remote work areas, that's what happens. In the Alaskas of the world, manufactured housing gets brought in and people have dorm rooms. And they walk down the hall to a dining hall and other recreational facilities. So that, and these can be made in modules. That stretch of units that you see there in the middle is about 75 feet long. That's what the modular companies like to work with. That's one truckload that they can bring to the site, 5 units taken care of, and the crane can lift that in one lift. They got 5 units in place. And the one on the left is a little more advanced in that the unit is 15 by 15, and it has its own bathroom, its own little kitchenette, a couple of closets, armoires, a double bed, it's a fold-out couch bed, a desk, and a dining table, of course, next to the window. And that's 15 by 15. Again, it's strung along a module that's about 75 feet long, so they could be trucked into the site and then lifted into place. They could lift about 7 a day and lock them into place in this seismic region. And so you can get a fair number of units fairly quickly if you take an approach like this. And I'm not a fan of technology. I'm a lifelong doubter of technology as a silver bullet in solving the housing problem. You know, it's just, but in certain cases it might make sense. And I saw how it did save time in the construction process. And for singles and couples who are starting their life, or they might be seniors sort of towards the end, the kids are gone, but they're still working, why not the 15 by 15? And if you're really young and you're starting out, you're right out of school, living in a 10 by 10 would be perfectly fine if you're able to live and walk in a town like Healdsburg. Healdsburg becomes your living room. You don't need a living room. You don't even need the recreation lounges on the first floor that you'd have in school. You've got the town, which is a great place as a living room. So those are my brief thoughts. In this case, you can see they're stacked 3 high. They're open air corridors. Again, no heating or ventilating the corridors and lighting them only at night. And you get through ventilation for the units because you can have windows on both sides. And a courtyard in the middle, so it's a pleasant environment. In this particular case, because it was formerly homeless, the street in the middle, it's a dead-end street, is set up to accommodate food trucks and mobile libraries and mobile medical units and those kinds of services that can come in on a truck and just park there. And so you don't have to build it on the site as support for the folks who need that kind of support. But there are some classroom modules, so they can have those classes and computer rooms. So that's the little bit that I have to offer to this. It's not very much. Like I said, it's costing $1 million a unit now to do affordable housing. The cost of construction is about $700,000 and the soft cost $300,000. We're doing teacher housing, affordable teacher housing in Berkeley. That's what it's costing.
Thank you. And what I'd like to do at this point is be able to ask some of the other panelists some questions, and just by show of hands, how many people have questions for the panel today so far? Great. So I'll keep that in mind, but I'd like to start off with Will. Could we, given your dual role as the business, as a business owner in Healdsburg, is also the Chamber of Commerce, you have a unique perspective on what businesses need around housing, as well as how that would work in our community. Could you discuss maybe what you see as the most significant obstacles to housing, and such as land use policies, fees, or additionally, how can the business community be more engaged in finding ways to achieve workforce housing?
I don't know if I have a unique perspective, but I've got one. I think, as a business community, we just need to continue to speak up and be actively engaged in what's happening here in town. In my perspective, again, we've continued to layer on more rules and regulations that have hampered our ability to develop in a methodical and in a manner that will allow us to prosper as a town. I've struggled, like many of my fellow business owners, in hiring on people, retaining people, and also serving our guests that are coming from near and far. I think that slide that you put up there, Stephen, showing our decline in population, again, no surprise, but very concerning as we look out to the future. looking at an aging demographic that is not going to be spending or consuming at the pace that we need to support the businesses here. I've talked to a number of people. I think that concept of a dorm would be a great thing for Healdsburg. Perhaps that we're bringing people in on visa programs for a 6-month period of time that could step into serving our front of house, back of house operations and our variety of businesses that we have, because we need the workforce here to support the business and to support the overall community. You know, on the matter of housing itself, something was shared with me or pointed out with me, almost 20 years ago with the then city planner, was when you look at Healdsburg, the way it was originally set up, the plaza and all the streets, going off it, it's pretty remarkable that we have all mixed housing, single family residence, townhouses, apartments, when you go up Tucker, Hayden, cross streets, Fitch, so on and so forth. And that hasn't continued, right? It stopped. Stopped because we put a GMO in place, right? It has really hampered our ability to build the housing that we desperately need. So, we're stuck with the continuing to see multi-million-dollar homes being renovated, and that trend will continue until we do make changes and we decide the future that we want to have here in town. But I just encourage a lot of smarter people than me on the zoning stuff and on the housing and whatnot, but when you start talking about $1 million a door, that's pretty pricey to pay. So there's got to be some way to also take those costs down. I think, we're doing little projects for our business. You look at other, the cost of capital to carry on developers, every day that goes on, someone's paying interest on that money. And people, I just think, generally don't have an understanding from a business standpoint on the finances of getting things completed. And it's easy to say, just, let the developer pay for it, but at the end of the day, it's all running into the cost of the structures that are being built. So streamlining that process has got to, I think, be a priority. And here locally, it's great to have council here, some council members. I think that should be a real focus, is getting these visuals up so people can see what density would look like in the downtown area, and moving expeditiously to get them built and filled.
Thank you. And that leads naturally into Larry is the CEO of Burbank Housing. You have a ton. I think you might be the largest multifamily property manager in the city of Healdsburg, with many different units here, as well as many under construction, which includes 3 apartment buildings that were purchased and currently under renovation, 2 of which have been completed on University and Pickering University. The third, which you can drive by on Prentice and see stripped down to the very bones of that project, but well underway, which speaks to what our last panelist just mentioned, the cost of building and what has changed. And I think this is a unique perspective for us to take a look at, especially with the scattered sites, which we started back in about 2019, and we saw quite a few changes in the financing. Larry, could you maybe share with our audience about the cost of building today and how that's becoming more of a challenge?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for inviting me here this morning to talk at 8 o'clock in the morning about housing. I was telling Stephen, I don't even talk to my staff at 8 o'clock in the morning about housing. So, but thanks for showing up and thanks for showing an interest. And I have to say, the city, I will come whenever Stephen calls to be on a panel because of the wonderful partnership that we've had with the city of Healdsburg. Now that goes back to Jeff's predecessor and has continued under Jeff's leadership here. But we actually got a call. I remember, actually, this guy who used to work for me, may know Efren Carrillo. He got a call, I think, from David Higley. This was about soon after the TOT increase had been voted on by the city of Healdsburg, if I'm getting the story right. And the money, as I understood it, for the TOT was it couldn't direct it. It had to be general fund, but it was intended to pay for affordable housing. And the gist of the message was, let's get going, let's buy some housing to make sure that we're using those funds correctly. And with the city of Healdsburg's assistance, we were able to purchase 4 buildings that were what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. These were units that were affordable historically, but they were on the market, and the history in places like Healdsburg, but all over, has been to buy the speculators to buy the buildings and then to essentially kick the people out there and raise the rents. And so the intent was for Burbank to come in and purchase, with the city's assistance, these buildings and permanently create affordable housing, which has been hugely successful. These buildings not only were purchased, but we've now renovated them. We're on the last building. We are finding the realities of construction are coming to roost, so to speak, on the last building. The others went very well. The last one we found, which is true of a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing, they're allowed to go into disrepair. And so we've literally, as Stephen said, we've had to pull it back to the studs and essentially rebuild it. Michael was wildly out of control with $1 million a unit. We're only at $650,000 to $700,000 per unit. A bargain up here, believe it or
Including
not.
your soft costs?
What's that?
Including all your soft costs?
Yes, all in. We're running, but the numbers that Michael's talking about is more in Inner Bay area, but they're still historically unprecedented in terms of the cost of building housing right now. Just to give you an example, we completed in 2019, I think it's a 65-unit project in Santa Rosa. It was called Crossroads, and that cost us about $400,000 per unit. The most recent projects we finished with Mike's firm's assistance in Santa Rosa, Caritas Homes, and a small project we're completing on the site of the former Journey's Inn Mobile Home Park, 162 units of affordable housing. It's coming in about $680,000 per unit all in. At the Crossroads project, I probably should have started with that, was 400, and this is now 3 years later, we've seen a 35% to 40% increase in the cost of construction. So something has to happen in terms of the construction industry. I'm not smart enough or technologically savvy enough to understand what the trends would be, but if we keep going like this, we just won't get anything built going forward. And so we've got to make changes, and those changes are structural. There are some on the government side. The state of California has been increasingly passing legislation to try to streamline the entitlement process. That's been helpful. We've now used SB 35, which was the original streamlining bill, 3 times to get through the entitlement process. Other jurisdictions, one in Sonoma County, Petaluma, have waived their impact fees that they charge for affordable housing. I think for all housing, but I know for affordable housing for sure. That's lowered the cost by orders of magnitude about $50,000 to $60,000 per unit. So all of these will help to be able to facilitate development. We're very bullish. We continue to work in Healdsburg. We were gratified to get a call, now I guess about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that the city wanted to purchase the L&M Hotel. With Jeff and Stephen's leadership, they were able to purchase it, renovate it. I believe it's all fully occupied now, and it's definitely, it's not workforce housing in the traditional way, but it certainly meets the need of the community. We're starting the end of this year to build, I'm going to blank, I think it's 56 units on Comstock's development in Healdsburg, and that's going to be largely a workforce housing project. In our definition, it's going to be focused on 80% annual median income and above, which is what has been. So there's a lot of definitions for workforce housing, but that's been the historic definition. By the way, for a family of 4, just to give you a context, because 80% AMI doesn't mean much to most people, a family of 4, it's about $100,000 is for, and that's considered low income in Sonoma County for a family of 4, $100,000. So that the rents on that will probably be about $1,400 to $1,500 a month for a 2-bedroom. So it is, below market dramatically, but still in the real world pretty expensive. And that's just the nature of Sonoma County. So yeah, continues to be a challenge. Housing costs continue to drive us. The latest one, by the way, and I'll give up the mic after this. So we always have something in the cycle. Right now it's insurance, and I'm sure some of you are experiencing that. Historic growth in costs for insurance. It's almost obscene. We actually were we're building a project in Napa right now that's for formerly homeless. It's a permanent supportive housing project. We're about 3 months behind. We had to purchase 3 months worth of construction insurance, and it's costing us $500,000 just to buy 3 months worth of insurance. So these are numbers that are just blowing everybody's budget out of the water right now. But it's always something. Right now it's insurance. Last year it was wood. Before that it was HVAC systems. So there seems to be always something coming at us, but we'll persist through it and keep building, certainly with partners like Healdsburg.
Thank you. And it's interesting, you know, actually for the general and the panel and the comments that I'm hearing here is that we have, it seems like, two very unique needs in Healdsburg. We have what we call kind of bread and butter, which are state tax credits, which focus on 60% and below, if I'm correct. And that feels a unique need when we look at the demographics that we're looking at. And we've been successful with partners like Burbank and Eden Housing in getting those types of projects into place. But there's also the question of the missing middle, is what we traditionally call people that make enough that they can't be placed into affordable housing, but they make too much, or they don't make enough to be able to purchase a house. And there's this housing desert in between what's affordable and what's not. We are lucky to have Jim here today, who is a member of our housing element work group. This was a large discussion during our housing element, but the state doesn't really take a lot of interest in that missing middle component. They're very focused on what we would call traditional affordable housing of 80% and below. These are things that we need to talk about moving forward because it's a unique need. Jim, you have a unique experience in Healdsburg, having been part of our original housing action plan, working around growth management ordinance amendments and advocacy. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on workforce housing and what we can do to get a better job of getting that in place and what that looks like. As a developer, you've had the River House properties, which is a unique design. How can that fit into our built environment?
Thanks, Stephen, and welcome everybody. Really great that you're doing this. Let's see, a couple of things in that question, and I think to Larry's comment about clarifying definitions is really key, because all the way back to 2015, we spent so much time talking about affordable and workforce and missing middle. So I think what you talked about, the housing desert, is really an important focus, because while affordable isn't affordable as in deed restricted, isn't easy, there are sources of funding out there for that. And so as you said, it's that group of people who make too much to get into deed restricted affordable housing, but not enough to buy something on the open market. And in many ways, you would say that is the backbone of the community. So that is what we're seeing hollowed out. And that's not unique to Healdsburg. I mean, that's our work around the country. That's a national problem because we have escalating prices at the market end, which we see here. Now, I mean, a $2 million house is not unrealistic anymore. And we have a lot of state and federal money flowing in to try and prop up and build more of the so-called deed-restricted affordable housing. So the question is, how do you fill that missing middle income, not missing middle product? And there's a whole host of things that go into that, and unfortunately everybody keeps looking for the one single thing that will solve the problem, and it's not. It's sort of, it's really a lot of different actions from policy. Our density regulations here are way too low for the value of the land. You can't make things work economically unless you're going to build one big house and sell it for $2 or $3 million. Our approval process, relatively speaking, the city, I think, is very collaborative and helpful, at least the experience I had at River House, but it's extraordinarily painful and long. And we just really need to accelerate that. There shouldn't have to be the processes that we take there. The biggest thing about development is, I think, is sharing in risk, and I think that's a lot of things that the community doesn't understand. I think developers come in and they got all this money and they do these projects and they sell them for $1.5 million, and we walk out with a big bag of money. That's not the case. There's a lot of risk. Larry mentioned insurance, these things that keep coming back at you every time that you hadn't anticipated. And so the ability of, first of all, the city to step in and provide some kind of funding backstop, if that's really what they want, and that could be whether it's a revolving loan, some kind of guarantees. We've seen instances in places like Vail and Aspen where the local employer will forward lease a number of units in rental apartments. So Vail Associates rented an entire building for their staff, as a way to secure bond financing and bring down the cost of the housing, but also de-risk that project for the developer. So I think it's the notion of de-risking. Providing other capital sources, whether it be, because you're not going to get the grants and the federal aid, so there has to be some other form of money. So whether it's housing trust funds, some kind of revolving fund, somehow the community has to be a partner if they believe this is important. But the other big challenge, and I know, again, back in 2015, we talked a lot about missing middle housing, and could you get, if you took the, if you incentivized builders to build missing middle housing by removing it from the GMO, which we have now done, would people build that? And the problem is, it's an unproven market as to whether people will buy a deed-restricted unit if they're in a certain income category, where maybe eating out one less time per month would actually allow them to ride the market up. And so there needs to be, so no developer wants to take that risk. So we need to find a way, again, for the city to partner, the community to partner, to encourage that kind of development to come forward, so that people will, in fact, we could build that, and people then would be able to test and prove out the market that there are people that want to buy and live in this community with some kind of an equity cap or equity inflation cap on the resale of the properties.
Thank you, and that's an interesting point, is that we do have an exemption for what we call the missing middle units. It was passed by a ballot measure. It's called Measure P, which allows, through our growth management ordinance, which allows up to 90 units over a 3-year period to be built, and that's approved by the voters, and it's a limiting factor to our development. We, through another ballot measure, allowed up to 50 units to be built per year within the missing middle, but they require a deed restriction. And the thing about a deed restriction is that it requires income verification. And as a part of that, if you're already in a position where you can buy in the market, and you run the risk of going over income, and this is not unique just to the missing middle, this is very important as well for those that are living in the 80% or below units too, is that there's this, what you would call kind of unwanted, but I would say it's a side effect of keeping units affordable, is that you almost encourage that income is limited at that point. And the fear of going over income in a unit and then being thrown into the housing desert, especially on the lower end of it, where you have just enough that you just qualified out, is a daunting challenge. And I think from a business community, that's very scary. If you have a long-term employee and you give them a raise, and now you're worried that they won't have housing in Healdsburg, they're no longer gonna be here, you think about the trip they're gonna make, they think about the trip they're gonna make. Is it worth losing an hours of pay and driving to come to Healdsburg to work when I'm capable of going someplace else? So we really do face a challenge with Measure P, and we have seen it used a few times, mainly at the Mill District in the North Village. We'll have some Measure P units, and then a developer over on 3 Healdsburg is gonna have some. But it is a challenge still to get people to take those units on, especially with the deed restrictions. And so with that, we're lucky to have Michelle here, the executive director of the...
Can I throw one thing?
Oh yeah, please, go ahead.
The situation, the scenario you just threw out, right?
Concerning employees and wages is absolutely true, right? We've had employees over the years not take wage increase out of the fear of losing their housing. And that is a very sad situation when we're limiting people's growth and potential to do better for themselves and for their families. So it's a reality, and there's a huge thing on communication and understanding, right? But that happens more often than not.
And that's a challenge that we do face, and I would like to ask our panelists here. Michelle is coming into the Community Development Commission with Sonoma County after your work on the RED. You've been at the center of trying to bring funding into our community. There are one thing that I think would be good for the audience to know is that the City of Healdsburg receives its federal and state grants through the Community Development Commission for the most part. Our home dollars, our CDBG dollars, come through what we call the City and Towns Advisory Committee, which we are represented on. And we make funding decisions and policies based around how we're going to utilize these federal funds. That's through the organization of the Community Development Commission. Healdsburg has done a really good job. I believe as the last check, we were Other than the unincorporated county, we received the most federal funding, and that's to speak to Burbank Housing applying for grants for 155 Dry Creek and developers actively seeking those funds. We do a good job of bringing in money, but we know there's a lot more on the horizon, and there's a lot of programs at the Community Development Commission that could be beneficial to employees. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about these opportunities coming up.
Thank you, Stephen. And looking out at the audience over the past 20 or 30 minutes, I haven't seen a smile on anybody's face. And so I'm going to share something we say about the city of Santa Rosa. And based on what Stephen shared about the demographics here may resonate. Santa Rosa, we've said, is where old people come to visit their parents. And those are the folks that are not generally part of our workforce, and we're here to talk about workforce housing. Before I talk about CDC programs, I want to share something that I learned actually from one of your board members, Larry. We were touring Burbank housing property, and it's affordable, very low income housing. And one of your board members got offended when somebody said that it wasn't workforce housing, and he said, hey, almost everybody that lives here is a member of our workforce. So affordable housing, even very low income housing, is workforce housing. It's true that there is a kind of a missing puzzle piece for the people that earn above 80% of the area median income. But let's all accept and embrace, especially when there's an affordable housing project that comes before a decision-making body, that is workforce housing. It's often opposed based on xenophobia and neighbors feeling like the workforce won't be living in that housing. So, and also before I get to CDC, I want to recognize that Stephen and Griselda are really involved regionally in the conversation about housing solutions. This is not a crisis that will be solved in a vacuum here in Healdsburg. The housing crisis is it's a national crisis, but our piece of it is a very regional problem that requires regionalism as a solution. And that's part of how the CDC fits into this. Stephen sits on the Cities and Towns Advisory Committee. He's a great advocate for Healdsburg's needs. He recognizes that it's not just one tool in your toolbox that's going to solve the housing crisis. It's putting every tool you can think of, every traditional solution and every innovative and emergent solution in your toolbox so that you've got a range of things you can use to address all of the pieces of the housing production puzzle. For housing to be built, everything has to go right. And almost always, it's way easier for things to go wrong than for things to go right. It's super frustrating. This is the most frustrating work I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding work I've ever done. So, CDC is a regional partner. We are hustling to attract as many resources as we can. As now that homeless services has moved out of the CDC and over to the county's health department, we can refocus our energy on attracting more resources to increase production, increase preservation, and in some cases, increase protections to keep people stably housed. Advice that I have for all of you here in Healdsburg is think of how strong our environmental ethic is in this county. You put something on the ballot that is related to the environment, whether it's funding for parks or our open space district, and it's going to pass. It's going to pass pretty easily. We don't have the same housing ethic, and we have partners here that are now working on building that housing ethic, and your city council here, I'm happy to say, has a good, strong housing ethic. But as a community, we need to reinforce that. We need to embrace that we need a diversity of housing solutions, and we shouldn't just on the face of them reject them because they don't look like what we live in or what we want to live next to. We should be open to the whole range of housing solutions, be open-minded about it, do our homework, consider the voices that aren't there at design review boards and planning commissions and city council meetings. We hear the reasons that we don't have everybody there. Sometimes it's, hey, I've got 2 jobs and 3 kids and I can't sit in your city council meeting for the next 3 hours. But sometimes it's the fact that there's a sense that maybe they don't feel like they belong in a planning commission, city council meeting, our CDC meetings. And when that's the case, it's incumbent upon all of us to do our homework, do a literature review, be a student of the housing crisis and housing solutions, and what does it mean to focus our solutions on equity. All right, so now to the question of CDC. I'm working every day to make sure we've got more resources that can be distributed. There's going to be a housing bond on the November 2024 ballot that is a general obligation bond. Will bring over $400 million to Sonoma County for affordable housing production, preservation, and protections. That's a windfall that we've never seen to address our housing crisis. You're going to be learning a lot more about it. I would encourage you to become a student of that housing bond. I think it's going to pass, and that is going to provide relief in Healdsburg and throughout the region like we've never seen.
Can I ask what's the AMI cutoff on that?
You can go up to 120% of AMI.
Thank you so much. And at this point, I would like to see if panelists have any other comments they'd like to share, but I would like to get out to the audience as well for questions. Seeing none, I will go and hand it off to questions. I can bring the microphone over to you. Go on.
Alan Cohen, local architect. I have a question about preservation versus production. So we've heard that a new build is $700,000 to $1 million, may or may not include land cost. Stephen and Larry, can you tell us what was it per unit to buy those apartments, and what has it cost to renovate those apartments?
Good question. Trying to go back in my head, and they varied broadly. You're right. In general, preservation is less expensive, but not always. And so I think the acquisition costs for the buildings in question was about $150,000, per unit to acquire, is what I recall. But the renovation costs it's actually 5 buildings that we've been renovating, vary from $150,000 per unit up to $350,000 per unit. And it really depends on the condition of the buildings that you buy. Unfortunately, landlords, and sometimes the way they're able to keep the rents low is by deferring maintenance and just not putting the money into the building, and they begin to deteriorate, and then at some point they unload them and say, we don't want the liability. And that was the case with one of the buildings, for sure, that we purchased with the city of Healdsburg, which is the reason we had to pull it back to its stud. So that one it's not, you're right, it's not gonna cost us $700,000, but with the acquisition for that particular building, it'll probably be over $500,000 per unit. So it really varies depending on the condition of the building that you're buying in terms of the preservation parts of it.
But isn't your processing time less?
Yeah.
You know, new construction has to go through the whole planning approval process.
Yeah, Mike's saying the processing time that's absolutely the case. I mean, the only thing obviously they're approved projects. We're not going in entitlements. We are going in for building permits, and the code issues are dramatically different from the time when they were built. So there is a lot of renovation work and inspections and the like that have to happen. But yes, it definitely is a much shorter time to go from purchasing to preservation of the affordable housings. They do have to impose what's called a regulatory agreement, which the local jurisdiction will layer on the property, but that ensures that it remains affordable, essentially into perpetuity, but I think 40 to 50 years minimum.
I would add, to answer that question, from the city standpoint, the cost of the subsidy into that has been about $56,000 a unit, which is really unheard of as far as the amount that's being put in. It was a good deal, but it did take a huge amount of different funding sources to put that project together. And it's still going. That kind of speaks to the complexity of putting these projects together. But as far as Measure S dollars being placed into that, it was about roughly $60,000 a unit in subsidy. Any other questions? Okay. Zeke?
My name is Zeke Guzman. I've lived in Healdsburg since 1959. You can only imagine what I've seen, okay? And the question I have for Larry is, we brought it up a little while with several of them. Where a project controls how much you can earn and support your family. If you're gonna, I've had farm workers come to me and say, Ezekiel, what do I do? My employers are offering me $1 an hour raise, but if I take the raise, I lose my house. Larry, what can be done about that? We're strangling our community, number one. Number two, Stefan and City of Healdsburg, you're underestimating the number of people leaving Healdsburg, the farm workers. Every week, 2 or 3 people come to me to say goodbye because I'm very involved in the community. Entire families are leaving, and you're underestimating the number of people leaving, not just farm workers. A good neighbor of mine, the Sherrards, they grew up here, they were born here, their children got an education, their children were teachers they couldn't afford here, they moved to Tennessee. My other question is, where are the large super corporate growers and industries that have caused part of this problem? Are they part of the solution? You know? Because listen, we have 2 wine countries here. We have one that's glamorous, where we smell the bouquet, and then we have the families and the people that create that, lining up in food lines so they can feed their families. That's what we have. There's no easy solution. I'm not going to sit here and say there is. I'm blessed that I was able to buy some land a long time ago and build a home. But my kids can't afford it here either. And they may be leaving here as well. What can we do? Larry, I mean, that's a question to all of you maybe. You know, I mean, is it at the national level where we say, okay, it's okay to stay in your home and earn additional income so you can afford a home in the future? That's the solution. I don't know. Because I'll just tell you one thing. As I drive into Healdsburg, those signs on the side that say 2 million to 8.1 million doesn't say poor people are welcomed. It doesn't say that. So I have that question for you, Larry. What can we do?
So a couple of questions in there, as I heard them. One was about farm workers. So there is actually a state program called the Joe Cerner program, which was not funded for many years. Under this administration, they actually put hundreds of millions of dollars into that program, and we were fortunate at Burbank to be able to compete for and win some of those funds. And so new projects we're putting up do have specifically farm worker housing in them. Unfortunately, the state program, as it's written right now, provides housing for folks who are at the very low income part of the population, so we would call it 30% AMI. The farm workers here make more than that, and so you get into the situation that you're describing where they start to hit the cap and they can't continue to occupy those units, or else we're out of compliance with the program. So I'm hoping that the folks in the agricultural industry here will be able to impress upon people like Senator McGuire and your Assembly member Jim Wood to be able to change that program to reflect the unique conditions that are here in the North Coast, in particular in the agriculture industry, so we don't have to kick people out. there was some recognition. It's not all bad. I'm completely cognizant of the point that Stephen brought up earlier about having people hit the cap and having been then pricing out of the units. We actually were marketing on behalf of the city, or we were doing the property management on a property which had 120% highest levels, 120% AMI. We couldn't lease those units because folks would come in and say, well, wait a second, I've got to pay how much in rent? And then I have to qualify every year in order to stay here. There just wasn't any security in that. And so we actually gave up managing that because it wasn't sort of our core mission as a nonprofit, but it also didn't seem to be working for us. I'm sure there are circumstances where it does, but in that particular case, it doesn't work. You were talking earlier also, I don't want to change the subject, but I know you brought up about home ownership. And I do feel as though home ownership is an area where we have not put a focus in terms of being able to try to build new homes. We at Burbank have built over 1,000 homes for home ownership. The most recent one was in Santa Rosa, a property called Lantana Homes, which we built 48 homes there. The people, you don't income qualify after you purchase the home. So it really doesn't cause a situation where you can be kicked out of it. Once you're in to those homes. Unfortunately, the programs to help subsidize those for folks at the lower end don't really exist on any grand scale. We are rolling out a program countywide at this point, and we're partnering with the City of Santa Rosa, and another county's been part of this for what's called a down payment assistance program. This was funding we received from the state of California. It's called Cal Home Funds, and these are $100,000. They're called soft silent seconds that sit on the property. You don't make any interest payments. They really only come due when you sell the home or you refinance it. It will assist many folks who are at the lower end to be able to compete, we believe, to be able to compete in the market by being able to get these essentially no interest loans to make down payment assistance, because home ownership is the way really, in my mind, to be able to to be able to really create community. People have a vested stake by having ownership. Fortunately, there aren't a lot of programs to be able to do that.
Hey Larry, on those units, is the resale capped in terms of some kind of appreciation?
So the resale is not capped, but we have an ability to buy the home back.
At market or at a sub market?
At a subsidied market. So there is growth. It's not. It doesn't grow to the market. But it's still one of the things I like to share with people is that even if you're capped in terms of your resale price, you're still building equity. Exactly. Instead of paying rent to a second person like Burbank, and we're very grateful to the folks who do pay rent, but we're also being able to build equity is a really critical part of it.
I'm going to step outside my wheelhouse for a moment and talk about money and not sticks and bricks. But, wealthy people find a way to avoid paying taxes. They hide income, and maybe even legally. Can an employer create a trust fund? They give them the increase in a wage, but it gets in an educational trust fund for the kids, for their workers' kids, or some way put it into a fund that's accumulating and maybe even being invested so that it accumulates. You're probably helping that worker avoid having to spend it, and it's actually a form of wealth that's growing on the side that they've earned through their wages, but they're not actually getting an increase in their income. It's a benefit that's actually producing some wealth. Can something like that be done by employers?
We had a question right here. Was it related to this particular topic? Or could we do, Andy, is a follow-up question to this particular, yeah, if you don't mind, and then we'll start a new thread.
Hi, I really appreciated the part of the conversation around home ownership, because I think that that's something that the city really wants to look at more carefully. I come from an area in Colorado where they have an extensive home ownership program for families. I currently have 5 employees who all grew up in Healdsburg, went to Healdsburg schools, and none of them can afford to live here, which is really tragic, and I'm sure everyone in the room has similar stories. But in the Roaring Fork Valley of Colorado, a lot of the
It is deed restricted home ownership, but they have 6 different categories of income, so you can come in at a very low income. But as years go by, your cap can continually increase. And then they also have what's called resident occupied deed restricted housing, so that is no income, but you do have to work within the community or within the county. It's a regional approach, but this has been a way that a lot of people have been able to actually gain some equity. And even though they're not going to make the big, massive increases when they sell, they know they're going to be able to sell it. So if it's a down market, they're going to be able to sell. They're going to get their money back, and they're probably going to get some more because it's going to go up at some point. So I think that that's something that is largely funded not through government grants. It's largely funded through industry. You were talking about some big companies. There is a lot of wealth in the community. So I think exploring how you can tap into the wealth in the community and the businesses that make a lot of money here to look at ways to help fund that kind of housing outside of the parameters of the very strict caps, because nobody wants to get kicked out of their housing. It's just too unstable. So I highly recommend really looking at that. The area also has a really unique, it's not quite dorm housing, but it's very close for some of your more seasonal workers, which I'm happy to get you in touch with the people that put that together. It's close to, it's more like university suites, I would say. So everyone has their own bedroom, but then there's like a common, kitchen, and it's really working out really well. So I highly recommend looking at some level of ownership for folks, because that's how people are gonna have peace of mind and stability and actually gain some wealth.
And we have a question right here.
Well, it's more of a comment and a question, I guess, for the City Council and the forum. My name is Tatiana McWilliams. I'm with Live Wine Country. I've been a realtor here since 2009. Just like Eric Drew, we are down in the trenches and we see what's happening. And I guess what frustrates me is here we are helping very wealthy people. We bring them to Healdsburg. They buy these homes, $1 million, $2 million, even $5 million in town. We really have gotten to that point. It's crazy. And as time goes by, these very wealthy people come up with these extraordinary ideas to build. Kind of like what Mill District is doing, Montage, and then they realize the amount of red tape that there is just to build a fourplex, to do a subdivision, to do anything. So we actually have people that have a lot of wealth that become in love with our community, that want to help our housing, that want to help that missing middle, that want to create beautiful places like the River House. But the big deflating point is the amount of red tape to get any permit in Healdsburg. These people come, they buy a home, during their retirement years, they want to do one big beautiful project in Healdsburg, but they don't do it. They don't put in their money. So I really would like they put in the money in Healdsburg, because again, it's almost impossible to get anything here done. So, I would encourage the City Council to find ways to incentivize these extremely wealthy people that are paying $7 million for a penthouse, $8 million for a third of an acre home. They have the wealth, they have the knowledge, they have the power to do good things for our community. Eric and I help people that are always saying, oh my gosh, I see we need another restaurant, or we need family restaurant. It's impossible to get a permit for anything, whether it's for a commercial permit, for a duplex. I remember in 2015, I was sitting here in the round tables that Jim Heid did, and I encountered a few community members who own like a half an acre in the north part of town. One of them I remember was a contractor. He's like, I've been dying to build a fourplex in my little piece of land. Then there was that 40-year program where we had people from out of town come and help us. The locals that have been here for 20, 30 years, they want to build. Like I encounter them all the time, but they're exhausted. They're exhausted with the amount of red tape that they find at the city. So again, just, everyone really vilifies the people that come to Healdsburg for second homes, but we actually need to tap into the private sector. If we leave it up to the public sector, it's not gonna happen. The private sector can build a home in, 10, 12 months, or remodel anything. But remodeling these days, it's impossible. The 2023 building code is impossible to meet. It's become so expensive. I think if Healdsburg, if we just focus on our town and create real incentives, whether it's lower permits or maybe some exceptions on the building code so they don't have to put fire sprinklers on a 1,000 square foot remodel. It just make it easy for these people that are buying these homes to spend the money here. The people that are coming here, they're not 80 years old, they're like 50s. People are retiring at 45 these days and they have so much energy. They want to remodel, they want to invest. They're not the bad people. They can help our community, and if you work with the realtor community and we understand maybe incentives, we can incentivize those wealthy people to invest in our community. So we're not going to stop the wealthy people from coming. Healdsburg is fabulous. So we can help with getting those people more involved if we work together and find ways to educate them on what the issues are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to address that point, I think I heard several themes in there, is how do we engage the private markets to help increase the stock of affordable housing with innovative ways, and the barriers that it takes. And there's always the question of cost, and then there's the question of certainty, right? And I think those two things are what developers want to see when they bring a project. But I'm hoping the panel, if you have any comments around these themes, you can weigh in.
Yeah, since my name was invoked, I'll mention a couple things I learned from the River House project, and I mentioned this earlier. I mean, I think the city as a collaborative partner in being innovative, I don't think there are many jurisdictions in Sonoma County or maybe even in the state where that project could have been pulled off as of right the way it was without the collaborative partnership that I had with Scott and people in planning and the building department. Some of the challenges that I saw are really at the state level, and that I've been doing a lot of work with the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, and one of the things that we've talked about, smaller infill projects like that are for sale get so encumbered by wonky things like the Subdivision Map Act that then open the door for a lot of additional costs. So our costs of processing and exactions and all those kinds of things was about $300,000 a unit because it was only 8 units, and some of those costs are fixed. So there's a local thing like the park impact fees and all those kinds of things that do add up. There's a time thing that then translate to interest costs and carry costs that add up. There's the consultant costs of coming back to Planning Commission 3 or 4 times that do add up. So all of those things could be streamlined a little bit, but I don't want to. I think the city is open and available, for trying to innovate, but there's a lot of things outside of their control, like the building codes, like fire safety laws, like Subdivision Map Act, that make this kind of infill housing very, very difficult to do and do it affordably. The original goal on River House was to deliver something that was in that middle market, and there was no way to make it work. Now, one of the reasons that it didn't work is because our land use code was so limiting. I wanted to do duplexes there, couldn't do it in that zoning code. I would have to go through general plan amendment, rezoning, and all of that, which, to Stephen's point, was too risky and too uncertain, so decided to go all single family. So there's things that we could do in the code by allowing more different types of fourplexes, duplexes, townhouses in residential zones. And then increasing the underlying density. That was capped at 8 units per acre. That site should have had probably 10 or 12. So those are easy fixes that hopefully will come out of the new study that the city is undertaking, the capacity study. But some of these other things are larger statewide issues, and as the state has taken a bigger role in showing a lot more leadership in trying to address things to increase housing between SB 9, the ADU legislation, a lot of things, I forget how many 65 different legislative pieces that are trying to drive the housing issues going through or have been approved. These are some of the things that also have to change, because I think people don't understand how complex the state has made it, as well as what's happening at the local level and things that we can change. So.
Thank you. And I had a question here, and then was it a follow-up comment, Zeke? And then over here and here, so I'll hand it over.
Thank you. Eric Zedrick, Healdsburg. I think I'm going to direct this to you, Jim, but it seems that virtually any housing forum held in Healdsburg, the elephant in the room is always the GMO. GMO was passed in 2000. GMO has ensured that other than subsidized housing, We haven't seen any creative multifamily and very limited single family other than McMansions, which are the only thing that pencils out due to the capacity limitations. 2015, Tatiana mentioned it, we had numerous forums in an attempt to educate the community the dire straits we were in, forecasting horrible housing shortage situations, skyrocketing costs. Thought you and the entire council did a phenomenal job spreading that information. Yet 2016, the city of Healdsburg voted 60% to 40% to deny Measure R, which attempted to reverse the GMO. Do you see any political solutions out there if the community remains like Jerry Brown labeled us years and years ago, that we hated housing?
You know, there's a great line in the industry that says there's two things that people hate, and that's sprawl and density. You had to bring up the GMO. I still have the scars from that. But yeah, I mean, it is the elephant in the room, or it's the obvious linchpin to trying to change the trajectory where we are in housing. I mean, the good news is, I think from where we were in 2015, where the majority of the population, A, didn't know we had a GMO, B, didn't understand what it meant. I mean, I would go around and talk to people and they'd say, 30 units a year? Wait a minute, you must have that wrong. That's like 30, you know, no, that's 30 units a year. That's all we allow. And people were flabbergasted. But then, you know, for a lot of different reasons, that didn't pass. But I do think there's a more educated community. I think there is a more, there's a greater understanding of the unintended consequences of what that has done in terms of the affordability of housing, basic, you know, Adam Smith Economics 101, limit supply, have a high demand, what's going to happen to pricing? So I think, you know, I think the time is ripe. I think people understand. I think there needs to be more education. The question is, what does that look like? And I think to Michelle's point, I thought was a really interesting one, and it's one I've noticed a lot. We do have a huge environmental ethic in this county, but I don't think we've coupled it with an understanding of what you don't put in a you don't put in an urban growth boundary. You don't commit to environmental protection and buy up lots of open land without creating dense downtown cores. And so we have a low density strategy for our towns, and then we have a buy up all the land around us, which is great. I mean, we all enjoy that, but we haven't, I mean, you go to Europe, it's dense cores and great protection of open space. And we've done one and not the other. So our environmental ethic has almost been the counterpoint and the undoing of our housing policy. So we have a lot of catching up to do, and we need leadership to say, no, 40 units downtown Healdsburg per acre is probably a reasonable and realistic approach to what we should be doing if we want a walkable, economically resilient downtown core that everybody who works here can live here. So I think those are things, and it definitely starts with the GMO, because as you mentioned, people can kind of figure it out, but if you are a builder in town, there is no incentive to build a smaller unit, because I can only build 1 or 2 units a year. I'm going to build 5,000 square foot homes. And the way the GMO reads, a 500 square foot unit takes the same allocation that a 5,000 square foot unit takes. So why would I ever want to build a 500 square foot unit? And not only that, the parking requirement for a 500 square foot unit is the same as a 5,000 square foot unit. So there's some things that are very out of kilter in the land use code, and then they're exacerbated by what the GMO does. And as to your point, things that would be more affordable, and not only more affordable, but more in tune with what emerging households want, which is they don't want a big single family home. They want to be in a live, work, townhouse downtown, or they want to be in some other kind of housing. We're 78% single family homes in town. That's not a balanced, healthy community mix for housing. So we need to be building a lot more of different product type, and unfortunately the GMO does not allow, it only incentivizes builders to do very large, very expensive homes, and then for the community to step in and build, you know, attached and rental, affordable housing, and everything in the middle gets left out. So the time is ripe for some change.
This is a real surprise to me as an outsider visiting, because of the growth management ordinances I've seen elsewhere. to prevent sprawl were accompanied by great increases in the allowable densities within the zone that you could develop. So I'm discovering today you don't have that. You have the opposite.
16 units per acre downtown.
That's crazy. Yeah, that seems to be was our mayor. Oh, she had to leave? And the council members. That seems to be the top item on the agenda here today.
Thank you. I'll get back to the questions.
Thank you, and I think to that point, we are launching into right now, we just hired a team to lead into what we're calling the downtown housing capacity study. Capacity is another less scary word for density, but that is our goal, right? You can't do one without the other, so we are looking at specific sites. We're gonna be doing some really interesting design charrettes, and the goal is to get the community to raise awareness and education around what does an appropriate density look like outside of the neighborhoods, maybe looking at some sites in neighborhoods. But to Michelle's point earlier, we're really fortunate in Healdsburg. We've built and have in the pipeline hundreds of deed restricted affordable rental units. We just did the ribbon cutting for Mike's building, the Randall that he designed at the Mill District. And we have 2 Burbank projects in the pipeline, one right behind Big John's, another one at the North Village. And then we have 100+ units right behind Parkland Farms in the Saggio Hills neighborhood. So we have hundreds of affordable rental and a handful of for sale that are coming online in the next little while, but we don't have those missing middle income units. We don't have the affordable by design dense units, and that's really a huge part of what we're missing. So we are probably 23 years too late, because when you do the GMO without increasing density, you get exactly what we have now. But the good news is we're doing it now. So it's better late than never. So the thing I wanted to ask, Michelle, you were talking a little bit earlier about your work at the Renewal Enterprise District and the RED Fund. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what is that fund? For a lot of folks in Healdsburg, we've never heard of the RED. So as we're looking at what Tatiana suggested earlier, how do we engage our private sector, the immense wealth that exists here with some of the growers or industry? What are creative funding solutions we can look at to bring some of those resources to the table for different housing types? And as we're looking at those density opportunities and those meetings we're going to be having over the course of the next months, we strongly urge you to come and participate in those forums. We will need every voice at the table who understands the challenge that we're currently in, because without every voice participating in those forums, we'll end up with a less than adequate result. So that's my invitation, and Michelle, can you talk about the RED a little bit?
Sure. The Renewal Enterprise District is a joint powers authority that the City of Santa Rosa and the County of Sonoma formed after the 2017 firestorm that wiped out over 5,000 housing units in a matter of hours overnight. The purpose of the Renewal Enterprise District, the Joint Powers Authority, which by the way is a government agency, is to accelerate the production of city-centered, mid to high density, equity-focused, disaster-resilient housing in infill areas. It's very narrow mission. And so I stepped in as the first executive director of this brand new agency and thought, why isn't this type of housing being built? And it was a financial problem, a developer math problem, but it was also you've got to de-vilify developers. It is the private sector that builds housing, and they do it better and faster than the public sector can. So I interviewed developers, learned that there's a developer math problem. It's a housing type that doesn't exist in Sonoma County generally. So when banks look at, well, am I going to finance this project? Any of us that have bought a house know that you've got to have comps to justify the size of your loan. The banks said, there are no comps, we're not going to fully finance this project. And it was true for market rate and that missing middle. but it also had a ripple effect onto affordable housing, deed restricted affordable. So we were pretty strategic about, okay, well, where's the state funding that we could be getting but we're not, and how can we become competitive for that? We figured out that through collaborative grant seeking, we would outcompete bigger communities or bigger counties or bigger cities. We have to compete in the same pool as San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and Alameda County and in some cases big jurisdictions in Southern California. Individual projects and individual developers could not achieve a competitive enough score to win an award, but we found out that by bundling projects, getting developers that ordinarily just look at one another as their competitors to collaborate on an application, that we could bring those awards in. So when Stephen talked about the $102 million, which is now up to about $132 million, we attracted that money in the last 3.5 years by changing our strategy, playing a good game, playing chess when our competitors were playing checkers. And what's going to be key for Healdsburg is SMART's coming up here. It's in the paper this morning. That unlocks a lot of resources at the state level that Healdsburg until now would not have been competitive for. So that's something to keep your eye on. What I also recognize is that a government agency can only do so much, and it moves at a kind of a snail's pace compared to what a nonprofit can do. And so that's why we formed the Red Housing Fund. The Red Housing Fund has $21 million in lending capital. It's a revolving loan fund. And the seed capital came from the city of Santa Rosa and the county's PG&E settlements, one-time money. So my message to, decision makers here in Healdsburg is when you've got one-time money, put it into housing. You're certainly not going to increase staff a lot based on one-time money. One-time money is perfect for catalyzing housing. And do it in partnership. The real estate agent at the back. It's wonderful that you have clients that want to be part of the solution. They're probably not developers, and developing, like I said at the beginning, is nearly impossible and super frustrating and super rewarding. But partnering is, if you're not a developer and you want to be part of the solution, partnerships are a way to get it done. And I've seen private interests partner with Burbank to get housing built. So collaboration, innovation, play the game differently, and partnership, I guess, would be my advice. And then to the city, one-time money, put it into housing. Thanks.
Thank you. And we had 2 questions over here, and I want to be respectful of time because I do want to allow the panel to give some closing remarks from each of the panelists. But we'll go ahead, and we had Eric and
I just wanted to kind of address what I call the making of the sausage, which nobody really wants to look at that carefully. But I'm representing the buyer and the seller of the 30-unit project on Healdsburg Avenue. We're going to close escrow on Friday.
Is your mic on?
Is it on? I'm just not holding it right. I'm sorry. So we're closing escrow on Friday. It's been a 3-year process since we thought it was almost done. There's so many different things. Number one, we created a better design by looking at it more carefully. There's just been all sorts of delays. We've moved from a 4% interest rate market to a 7% interest rate market, and we're getting it done anyway. At this time of year, sensitivity to things like rain delays. If we had, there are a million different things that can cause an additional 2-month delay on that project, which would put it off till next May. Lose a whole year by not moving. That's what I call the making of the sausage. You look at the city of Healdsburg, that Burbank is working on Dry Creek. I call it the Zagani property. The city bought that property 25, maybe even 30 years ago, and it's been in process for at least 25 years, and it's finally actually going to happen. Dry Creek Road. That's, you know, and you look at the project, what I call the Waltonspiel Trailer Park, just north of Oliver's in Windsor. You saw in the paper today that has been in the process for a whole bunch of different projects for at least 20 years, and they just abandoned what is, I think is 389 rental apartments that would be really designed, you know, designed for affordable. They're changing that. They're eliminating. Did I read it right? 60% of the units down to maybe 160 for sale residences changed today. You know, if you've followed that project, you've seen it evolve many, many times. You know, I can go over, you know, the closed escrow on Sajo Hills in 2005 for cash to develop a resort and housing. There was two kinds of housings approved in 2005 with an EIR in place in 2005 that included 14 acres of affordable housing, 130 room resort, and 66 high-end homes. 18 years later, we're finally getting people moving into the high market rate homes, and we're going to be at least 20 years through the process to actually get affordable housing. I could go on in this decade-long process that I just call the making of the sausage. It's not you guys making decisions. It's not the city. It's the macroeconomy affecting it. It's the microeconomy affecting it. It's people's lives. You know, people actually die in the middle of projects, or they go broke. All of these things happen, and the more you can get out of their way to help make it happen, are more likely to solve things like an early winter could cost a year on an early range could easily cost a year on this project, which is the first market rate rental housing in Healdsburg in 23 years. If we have heavy rain starting now, we might lose a year on it. But you know, that's just you know, again, don't know a better word for it than making the sausage, and you have to look at the whole thing. There's so many similar projects that take literally decades from conception to changes to finishing it out. Eric Drew, Healdsburg Realty, Healdsburg Sotheby's Realty.
And what I'd like to do before the panel, in the interest of time, we just have about 10 minutes left. We could take a question, and then we can go back to the panel. Maybe we take the questions that we have remaining, and then we have the closing remarks around those. So,
hi, I'm Jonathan Perlman. I'm a local architect. I work on a lot of multifamily projects in San Francisco where the affordable component always has to be part of the building, included in the building, and made somewhat invisible, so that there's an equity aspect of all these people live together and it makes for a better community. And here, while we've been incredibly successful at creating a lot of affordable housing, it feels like I hate this word, ghettoizing, because we're building, a building at a time that is all affordable housing, and it's not incorporated into, so the Mill District is this phenomenon of wildly expensive houses over here, and behind McDonald's is the beautiful building of the Randall that's all affordable. So I'm wondering if, as part of all this thinking around the GMO and the capacity study and all of this, if that there's some advantages for a developer that if you incorporate the affordable housing into it, that you can not be subject to the GMO, for instance, if you did a certain percentage, so that you could increase, and your density could increase, or some ways that you create equity in the sense of equality, not equity in terms of money, but you also then incentivize developers to move forward on some projects that right now don't even get close to pencil.
I have one comment to make on that before others. A lot of those inclusionary programs are at 5–10%, maybe.
Not San Francisco.
Yeah. What is it? 15?
22.
Yeah, but that goes up to 120%.
And with density
But it goes
bonuses.
up to 120% AMI, it's not very low income, yeah. What happens is you don't get as many units actually in the end. With the nonprofit sector is producing quite a number when they can do it on their own with their sources of capital than trying to do it through the private sector. And it ends up being a pain in the neck actually for the private sector. And I'm not one to, you know, be there, carry their praise typically. But I think it's been a burden on them. Have them put that money towards a fee that goes then into the affordable fund where the nonprofits really know how to use it better. Because a lot of those folks also need wraparound services, which the private developers are not going to supply. So those affordable housing units that are built into the market rate units, those are lonely people if they're down at 60% because they don't have access to those services. And they attend a residence meeting, they're not as articulate as the PhDs and master's degree people who are in the market rate segment. So they don't go to the meetings. You know, so it's not ghettoizing, it's helping people become who they really are and can be, and putting them in circumstances where they can really flower. So I get a little annoyed by that ghetto.
And I'm sorry, I really am looking at more missing middle.
Yeah.
You know, than I am at 55 AMI or something like that. Obviously, you can't mix those.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I take a little different opinion than Michael, because I think in urban areas that's true, but in the landscape of Healdsburg, I mean, the problem that you point out is really good. Nobody's building apartments, so you couldn't get an inclusionary component anyways, and the only way to get financing is to concentrate a certain income level, you know, through Larry's good work, you know, into a single building. So I don't think that creates a healthy fabric across a community, and it seems like the city could create density bonuses, and part of the GMO modification might be a bypass that if you have 20%, you know, 80 to 120 or 120 to 160 included, you get a get out of jail free card for the GMO. So it incentivizes people to build apartments, which we desperately need, commit a certain number of them to a protected income level that is serving that middle workforce that is missing. And I agree, based on history, the math is that you leverage your dollars better to have the developer buy out into affordable housing if you have an infrastructure to deliver it. But look at the number of units that were built in the city by the private sector, San Francisco, versus those the funding. And it's a 300 to 1 kind of ratio. So the private sector knows how to deliver units, and especially if it's not working in that, you know, 50 to 80 kind of percent AMI. It's the group in the middle that we really need. So I think there's something in that solution that bundles together a lot of the problems we have that should be taken seriously as we look at the kind of the next phase of playing with the dials to accelerate housing.
And I just want to add really quickly on that point, something that Healdsburg should take note of that is working. So we're building an inclusionary project in Healdsburg. We hope to break ground, building department willing, by the end of this year on a property that Costeaux owns, which they're going to be building a hotel, and we're building the affordable component, and affordable there is going to be 80% AMI. That project would not happen if Healdsburg had not tied the occupancy permits for the hotel to the building of that affordable project. Factually, they would have walked away from that a long time ago. So that is working. That project is going to get built, and it's going to be built because it's the C of O for the market rate is tied to the affordable.
And they're in separate buildings.
They're separate buildings.
Yeah, they're next to each other. It's not a ghetto. It's as good as you're going to get in this country.
I'm about to jump out of my skin. What you're describing is the gold standard, and it should be the goal. Inclusionary, floating door, invisible door, whatever you want to call it. The greatest indicator of academic success for the child in a household that has a modest income is living in very close proximity to households where the parents have graduate degrees. And I, with all due respect, would say that some of the most articulate comments I hear in housing forums come from people with lived experience who have experienced discrimination in their housing. I've been at lots of ribbon cuttings lately, thankfully, and you get a formerly houseless tenant that comes and speaks after the elected officials and says the most poignant thing. So it happens in a healthy housing finance market, and that's why it works better in San Francisco than it does here. We can get there. We'll get to a healthier housing finance market, and we will see more inclusionary housing. But I just want to make a pitch for it being producing the best outcomes. And unfortunately, the way housing is financed here, it kind of separates the projects. Thank you for bringing it up. It's a really important point.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I think we're running up against our time. And so I know there's still some questions out there, and hopefully the questions that weren't asked can maybe be, if you can capture somebody at the end, but it's a lively discussion. I want to just take a moment to thank our panelists, the Chamber of Commerce, and everybody for attending today. And if we could give our panel a round of applause. It's coming to talk about housing on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. But that speaks volumes for the people that are here, that it's such an important issue. And just really quick on a closing comment, I'd like to say that this is a continued discussion. As the mayor mentioned before, we have a downtown capacity study that we're going to be getting. The Housing Element Work Group is continuing with their work with public meetings and workshops. On October 22nd, we will have an employee housing forum and resource fair that will be held here, which will include a larger variety of services, as well as discussions with legal aid and a variety of topics that will help employees to navigate the housing environment. But just want to say thank you. I appreciate the involvement. And with that, we have one last comment here, and I think that will be a great way to end. Thank you.
This comment has to deal with the language that you use when talking about density, the D word. About 20 years ago, I stopped using the word, and I replaced it with levels of coziness. There's 20 cozy units per acre, there's 40 cozier units per acre, and the coziest, the best, are 60 units. So start talking about coziness and your quotient for coziness. I think it helps to get the public to realize that it's a good thing to live together.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. Appreciate it.